Chapter 2. Deteriorating Oil and Food Security. The 20th century was the oil century. In 1900, the world produced 150 million barrels of oil. In 2000, it produced 28 billion barrels, an increase of more than 180-fold. This was the century in which oil overtook coal to become the world's leading source of energy. The fast-growing supply of cheap oil led to an explosive worldwide growth in food production, population, urbanization, and human mobility. In 1900, only 13% of us lived in cities. Today half of us do. The world grain harvest quadrupled during the last century. Human mobility exploded as trains, cars, and planes began moving people at a pace and over distances scarcely imaginable when the century began. Today, we are an oil-based civilization, one that is totally dependent on a resource whose production will soon be falling. Since 1981, the quantity of oil extracted has exceeded new discoveries by an ever-widening margin. In 2006, the world pumped 31 billion barrels of oil, but discovered fewer than 9 billion barrels of new oil. World reserves of conventional oil are in a free fall, dropping every year. Discoveries of conventional oil total roughly 2 trillion barrels, of which 1 trillion have been extracted so far, with another trillion barrels to go. By themselves, however, these numbers miss a central point. As Michael Clare notes, the first trillion barrels was easy oil, oil that's found onshore or near to shore, oil close to the surface and concentrated in large reservoirs, oil produced in friendly, safe, and welcoming places. The other half, Clare notes, is tough oil, oil that's buried far offshore or deep underground, oil scattered in small, hard-to-find reservoirs, oil that must be obtained from unfriendly, politically dangerous, or hazardous places. At some point in the not-so-distant future, world oil production will peak and turn downward. When it does so, it will be a seismic event. The only world we have known is one where oil production is rising. In this new world, where oil production is no longer expanding, one country can get more oil only if another gets less. We are witnessing a fundamental shift in the relationship between oil and food, one that has been in the making for several decades. From 1950 to 1972, a bushel of wheat could be traded for a barrel of oil on the world market. The price of each during that period was remarkably stable, averaging just under $2 per bushel of wheat and per barrel of oil. Since then, oil prices have climbed. In late 2007, even with the recent run-up in wheat prices, it took 8 bushels of wheat to buy 1 barrel of oil. Agricultural analysts have long been concerned about the effect of the coming rise in oil prices on food production costs, but now the price gap is so wide that the United States is starting to convert grain into fuel for cars. When the price of oil rises above $60 a barrel, it becomes highly profitable to do this. An estimated 16% of the U.S. grain harvest was converted into automotive fuel in 2006. For the 2008 harvest, the figure could be close to 30%. The line between the food and energy economies is becoming blurred as the two begin to merge. As a result, the world price of grain is now moving up toward its oil price equivalent. If the food value of a commodity is less than its fuel value, the market will move it into the energy economy. The coming decline of oil, when the price of oil climbed above $50 a barrel in late 2004, public attention began to focus on the adequacy of world oil supplies, and specifically on when production would begin to decline. There was no consensus on this issue, but several prominent analysts now believe that the oil peak is imminent. Various approaches are used to analyze the oil prospect. Oil companies, oil consulting firms, and national governments rely heavily on computer models to project future oil production and prices. As with any such model, the results vary widely, depending on the quality of data and the assumptions fed into them. Another approach uses the reserve/production relationship to gain a sense of future production trends. This was pioneered in 1956 by the legendary M. King Hubbert, a geologist with Shell Oil and later with the U.S. Geological Survey. Given the nature of oil production, Hubbert theorized that the time lag between the peaking of new discoveries and production was predictable, noting that the discovery of new reserves in the United States had peaked around 1930. He predicted that U.S. oil production would peak in 1970. He hit it right on the head. As a result of this example, and other more recent country experiences, his basic model is now used by many oil analysts. A third approach separates the world's principal oil-producing countries into three groups: those where production is falling, those where production is still rising, and those that appear to be on the verge of a downturn. Of the leading oil producers, output appears to have peaked in a dozen or so, and to still be clearly rising in 9. Among the post-peak countries are the United States, which peaked at 9.6 million barrels a day in 1970, dropping to 5.1 million barrels a day in 2006, a decline of 47%. Venezuela, where production also peaked in 1970, and the two North Sea oil producers, the United Kingdom and Norway, where production peaked in 1999 and 2000, respectively. The pre-peak countries are dominated by Russia, now the world's biggest oil producer, having eclipsed Saudi Arabia in 2006. Other countries with substantial potential for increasing production are Canada, largely because of its tar sands, and Kazakhstan, which is developing the large Kashagan oil field in the Caspian Sea. The other pre-peak countries are Algeria, Angola, Brazil, Nigeria, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. Libya, which is now producing 1.7 million barrels a day, plans to double its output to over 3 million barrels a day, close to the 3.3 million it produced in 1970. The next group are countries that appear to be nearing a period of production decline, including Saudi Arabia, Mexico, and China. The biggest question mark among the major oil producers is Saudi Arabia. Saudi officials claim that the country can produce far more oil, but the Ghawar oil field that has supplied half of Saudi oil output is 50 years old, and is believed by many analysts to be in its declining years. With the crown jewel of world oil fields and other older Saudi fields largely depleted, it remains to be seen whether pumping from new fields will be sufficient to more than offset the loss from the old ones. Somewhat ominously, Saudi oil production data for the first 8 months of 2007 show output of 8.37 million barrels per day, a 6% drop from the 8.93 million barrels per day of 2006. If Saudi Arabia does not move much above its current level, which I suspect may be the case, then peak oil is on our doorstep. In Mexico, the second-ranking supplier of oil to the United States after Canada, production apparently peaked in 2004 at 3.4 million barrels per day. Geologist Walter Youngquist notes that Cantarell, the country's dominant oil field, is now in steep decline, and this could make Mexico an oil importer by 2015. China, producing slightly more than Mexico, may also be approaching its peak year. The question is, will production actually increase enough in the pre-peak countries to offset the declines underway in the post-peak countries? Another clue to the oil production prospect is the actions of the major oil companies themselves. Although oil prices have risen well above $50 a barrel, there have not been any dramatic increases in exploration and development. This suggests that the companies agree with the petroleum geologists who say that 95% of all the oil in the world has already been discovered. The whole world has now been seismically searched and picked over, says independent geologist Colin Campbell. Geological knowledge has improved enormously in the past 30 years, and it is almost inconceivable now that major fields remain to be found. The bottom line is that the oil reserves of major companies are shrinking yearly. Sadad al-Husseini, former head of exploration and production at Aramco, the Saudi national oil company, pointed out in an interview that new oil output coming online had to be sufficient to cover both estimated annual growth in world demand of 2 million barrels a day and the annual decline in production from older fields of over 4 million barrels a day. That's like a whole new Saudi Arabia every couple of years, Husseini said. It's not sustainable. The geological evidence suggests that world oil production will be peaking sooner rather than later. Matt Simmons, a prominent oil investment banker, says in reference to new oil fields, "We've run out of good projects. This is not a money issue. If these oil companies had fantastic projects, they'd be out there developing new fields." Kenneth Defies, a highly respected geologist and former oil industry employee now at Princeton University, said in his 2005 book, Beyond Oil, "It is my opinion that the peak will occur in late 2005, or in the first few months of 2006. Walter Youngquist and A.M. Samson Bakhtiari of the Iranian National Oil Company both projected that oil would peak in 2007. It is quite possible that Defies, Youngquist, and Bakhtiari are close to the mark. The International Energy Agency, IEA, reports that world oil production in 2005 of 84.39 million barrels per day rose to 85.01 million barrels per day in 2006. For the first 9 months in 2007, output averaged 84.75 million barrels per day, slightly less than in 2006. Whether output in the last 3 months of the year will rise enough to take the annual output above the 2006 level remains to be seen. As of this writing, whether it does or not, there is a clear loss of momentum in production growth that, in the face of rising oil demand, will almost certainly translate into higher oil prices in the near 17 term. Yet another way of assessing the oil prospect is simply to look at the age of the major oil fields. Of the top 20 fields ever discovered in terms of oil reserves, 18 were discovered between 1917, Baliva in Venezuela, and 1968, Shabra in Saudi Arabia. The 2 more recent discoveries, Cantarell in Mexico and East Baghdad field in Iraq, were discovered during the 1970s, but none have come since then. Even Kashagan, the only large find in recent decades, misses making the all-time top 20. With so many of the largest oil fields aging and in decline, offsetting this with new discoveries or stepped-up production at existing fields using more advanced extraction technologies will become increasingly difficult. If 2006 does turn out to be the historical peak in world oil production, and if the output trend follows a bell-shaped curve, one where the shape of the curve on the ascending and descending sides is more or less symmetrical, as with the classic Hubbert-Speed curve, then we can use the recent historical trend to estimate the likely future trend. In recent decades, politics and prices influenced oil production levels, but we may now be moving into an era of aging oil fields, where geology will largely determine production trends. Based on this, to project oil production from the peak year 2006 to 2020, we simply go back 14 years, to 1992. Output that year averaged 67 million barrels per day. It then climbed to 85 million barrels per day in 2006, an increase of 18 million barrels per day. If the production decline is symmetrical, then output per day in 2020 would again be 67 million barrels, a drop of 21%. Assuming a 1.1% annual rate of world population growth from 2006 to 2020, for a total growth of 16%, oil supply per person would drop by a staggering 32% in just 14 years. In stark contrast to this projection of 67 million barrels per day in 2020, based on the Hubbert-Speed curve, the IEA is projecting world oil output in 2020 at 106 million barrels per day. If production did peak in 2006, And if future production does follow the Hubbert curve, what are the options? One is to look for oil in even more remote places. Some of the estimated 5% of conventional oil not yet discovered may be in the Arctic. With the prospect of a nice free Arctic Ocean within a few decades, countries bordering the Arctic are beginning to think about oil exploration within the region.